We can now add FDA Commissioner Robert Califf, I don't know how to pronounce his last name, Califf, to the growing list of high-profile Democrats that have now publicly endorsed federal reform of cannabis policy. Those of us who've been in the industry long enough to experience nearly a decade of both parties of U.S. government teasing us with a bunch of hot one day, cold the next, it's right around the corner, I promise, dick teasing ass rhetoric, could really care less about another round of lip service without the happy ending. But hey, it's Friday. And I guess they want to keep our eyes off the ongoing U.S. taxpayer-funded human atrocities going down in Gaza, so let's do it. Marijuana Moments Kyle Yeager reported that FDA Chief Califf says that there's no reason for the DEA to further delay making a decision on marijuana scheduling. Califf also said that as a child of the 60s, it would be nice if in his lifetime we came with a regulatory scheme for cannabis. At a hearing before the House Oversight and Accountability Committee on Thursday, South Carolinian Republican Nancy Mace pressed Califf on the timeline for scheduling review after his agency under the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services recommended that the DEA move cannabis from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3 under the Controlled Substances Act, to which he responded, "The timing of a regulatory decision is something that would be up to the DEA and not up to me. There's no reason for the DEA to delay. They have to take into account all the regulations that are in play." Asked whether he expects FDA would assume additional regulatory responsibilities if cannabis is rescheduled, the commissioner said that is a very complicated topic. Sure it is, buddy. Especially given that this falls in the area where state regulation has been dominant. This is an area where I believe we could be better off, and if we had guidance from Congress about how to proceed. Kind of oxymoronic. He's asking Congress for guidance here, but let me keep going. Medical marijuana is one thing where there's a medical purpose and it's proven through traditional medical pathways, but when it's used for recreational purposes, there is no medical benefit in that case. It does not fall under our typical regulation. Mace, who also recently discussed scheduling issues and the need for a GOP-controlled House to advance cannabis reform legislation. And the only one cheering in that crowd was probably Jason Beck. But she also raised concerns about the prevalence of hemp-derived intoxicating cannabinoids and the lack of regulations around those products. Without revealing too much about my age, I'm a child of the 60s, so it would be very nice in my lifetime if we came up with a regulatory scheme where whatever your belief is about the use of a product, where the safety issues that you refer to and are written into law so that we have a scheme whereby we can regulate it. Texan prohibitionist Pete Sessions also addressed the cannabis scheduling issue, stating he believes that FDA did not base its assessment in scientific facts or realities of how marijuana has been abused and used in our country today. And the FDA's recommendation to reschedule cannabis completely ignores the realities of a drug that is causing enormous consequences of children and adults in our country, high schools, middle schools, and communities. Children, children, children. Save the children. Settle down, Pete. Settle down. He then repeated talking points that he and other GOP lawmakers forwarded to DEA Administrator Ann Milgram, urging the agency to keep marijuana in Schedule 1 of the CSA, including criticisms of the revised review process FDA used that involved a new and two-pronged analysis instead of a five-factor review that has been used in the past. Kyle Yeager says that the opponents of the cannabis reform argue that this policy shifts its evidence to of FDA intentionally exercising more discretion to justify its rescheduling recommendation for political rather than scientific reasons. And I think he has a point there. Califf responded with a jab alluding to the lack of cohesive messaging coming from the right. Let me remind you that Schedule 3 does not put marijuana on the market in the United States, and with all due respect, I think cannabis is differentiable from heroin, and I think cigarettes and your colleague just gave exactly the opposite point of view on marijuana policy, referencing Mace's comments. Eager to make headlines for anything other than the current ethics probe digging into his alleged attempt to profit off of Donald Trump's second impeachment probe, Oversight Committee Chairman James Comer gladly took the bait and all the damn airtime, responding with a 5-minute diatribe. His monologue basically saying the FDA is putting its own bureaucratic priorities over the American people by refusing to regulate hemp products such as CBD unless it received additional authorization from Congress. So, yes, we all here know that this is all a bunch of kabuki theater bullshit, and both sides have just taken turns over the last 10 years when most convenient to make us believe that they really care about cannabis reform. With an 80+% polled approval rate, cannabis reform is currently clocking in better numbers than either party's presidential candidate. In fact, the only thing over 80 right now when it comes to the most despised American government in modern history is the ages of both of their candidates. Americans have wised up to everything that our government is at fault of over the last decades, generations, and all of that. And we just need them to stop dividing us on something that we all come together for. That's like my take on all of this, is they're trying to divide us when we all want cannabis to move forward. And they're trying to make it a left or a right issue. It's really not. It just so happens at this current moment of time, the Republicans are choosing the hard line prohibition stance, right? So I don't know where to take of this. I'm tired of even covering these stories all the time, but they keep on popping up in headline news because they're trying to distract us from the other shit that they can't get done around the world and all these chickens that are coming to roost. That's just my take on everything. I love to hear from everybody else. I'm Rico Lamitte, the dopest dad on the street. It's Friday. Put a smile on. Let's talk about it.
Mm-hmm. I mean, this is probably crazy, bro, but I somewhat agree with Pete Sessions on this a little bit. You know, the FDA is way out of their boundaries in being able to say that, or HHS is way out of their boundaries in calling for this rescheduling. And so,
you're siding with Prohibition, Pete?
I'm, well, not on everything that he said, but on some of the fundamentals, yes.
Is he related to Jeff Sessions?
No, they are not related.
He's a clone.
One's fat, and one's skinny and small.
I thought it was like his son or something. I'm like, oh no, that's a wrong legacy to have.
No.
You know?
One's a classic elf and the other one is Will Ferrell.
Oh boy.
Got it.
Jeez Louise. Jeez Louise, you guys. Yeah, no, I mean, I mean, Dr. T, what do you think? Did HHS overstep their bounds because of this, because of the criteria of how they would reschedule drugs and the fact that cannabis can't be rescheduled under their criteria, how it presently is? They have to redo the whole framework. Do you feel that they overstepped their bounds? I think you're on mute. You're on mute, Dr. T. You're on mute. There we go. Now you're good, Dr. T. Yep.
No, was my answer.
No. Are you just saying that from the activist perspective, or are you saying that in all medical seriousness?
Medical seriousness, I think that all the agencies should weigh in on this plan. Mm-hmm. You know, not some of the agencies have more expertise than others. But none of them have expertise over a plant. They rarely study plants. But in regards to it being a safe product, that's obvious that it's a safe product, and for them to recommend rescheduling because it's a safe product is a good idea.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Mark, you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, rescheduling is a non-starter. Rescheduling a plant that people can grow themselves to Schedule 3 under the Controlled Dangerous Substance Act is just, foolish. The trap is going to win all day long. A plant people can grow themselves is not a drug, it's a plant. And so, the FDA has recognized that the current methodology that they have in place to evaluate drugs, which are single active ingredient formulations, to take through clinical trials, just does not fit into herbal medications like cannabis. And so cannabis is not a drug. It's a medicinal herb, and it needs to be regulated as such. And whenever a medicinal herb can provide relief to a medical condition or any kind of suffering, it should not only be lawful, it should be encouraged before prescribing all these FDA-approved drugs made by drug companies, sold at drug stores, paid for by drug insurance. It's a complete, self-fulfilling prophecy that medical doctors today, for the most part, are basically just drones of the pharmaceutical industry to dispense their, medication. And is there life-saving medication that the FDA has approved through clinical trials? Absolutely. But things like medicinal herbs, which do have, medicinal properties. In fact, you were talking about the Health and Human Services. It's the Health and Human Services agency that owns U.S. Patent 6600305 or whatever the hell it is, the patent that the United States government has on the neuroprotective properties of cannabinoids, including CBD. So how could the Health and Human Services, right, basically did this research at Bethesda, paid for by our tax dollar, with THC that they smuggled from Meshulam's lab? Yeah, that's right. The NIH smuggled THC into the United States to do all this research on so they could file their patent, right? Which basically proves what we know, which is that CBD has neuroprotective properties. So how can they say there's no accepted medical application when the USPTO, which doesn't give a shit about our drug policy, looks at the data and says, you know what, this is a patent. This is a patent because you can't predict this from the prior art that's been disclosed before it. So what they deemed as accepted medicinal value, they granted a patent for, and actually the U.S. government licensed that patent to a small company in Pennsylvania to develop new pharmaceuticals from. So while the U.S. government is locking up people for smoking cannabis and for growing and producing cannabis, they're collecting a licensing revenue on their patent that the U.S. government owns, which means us, the taxpayers. Yes, it's coming up on April 15th. We're all acutely aware that we own the U.S. government, not the politicians in Washington, D.C. It's broken, it's fucked up, and they don't know how to regulate cannabis. And so all this is just all bullshit lip service. End of rant.
I agree. And on that, we're going to go to a commercial. We're going to be right back.